the genesis of the mimetic theory is literary. I was teaching at Indiana University, and I came as this was in 1948, 49. And I had a student visa. I had a degree in roughly medieval history, medieval archives, and I had absolutely no notion of what I was going to do. And very quickly, in spite of my total lack of experience, I was given courses in French novels and translation, in English translation. Some of these I had not read in French, but I was keeping up with it. I was always a few pages ahead of my students. And I was wondering about what I could tell them about these books, which either I was reading for the first time or for the second time because I had read them for high school education or pleasure. And instead of moving, like much of literary criticism, is of differentiating, the idea of differentiating these works. See what makes them similar to each other. And I decided that what made them similar to each other is that there was an involvement between the characters which was much more essential, much more fundamental than what they were individually, that the relationship between them was the essential thing. And what one had to understand about that relationship is that it was not necessarily an influence, a direct influence of someone being impressed by someone else and espousing their ideas, but that very often it was the opposition between these characters which defined them, and that their opposition was what made the other essential to the self, but in a paradoxical way, since it could transform their view of themselves and of each other. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that it had to be, well, maybe I'm going to get an example, a very simple example, because it's at the beginning of Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, which was one of the novels which was fundamental to my literary education, but also to all my ideas. At the beginning, there is a child who talks about his own life and his relationship to the world. And for a long time, he wants to go to the theater. He's never been to the theater, and he has a mythical idea of what the theater is going to be, a tremendous importance it has for him and how it's going to upset his life entirely. And then he goes to the theater. We know that this is autobiographical. Have you heard of Sarah Bernard? The great tragic actress of the end of the 19th century, where it was a performance of Phaedra of Racine with her that he went to. And he was unbelievably disappointed in a way. It just didn't work. His experience did not correspond to the idea he had previously. This idea previously was literary because he knew a great writer who was named Bergotte in the novel, it doesn't matter, and who had prepared his mind to this great experience that was suddenly shattered and destroyed by the experience itself. So the next day, there was a visit in the family of an old diplomat, you know, we know who he is in reality, but it doesn't matter at all. And the father and the child were the three characters in that second scene. And the father said that Marcel, the child, had gone to the theater the night before and enjoyed it greatly, and it was still force in the mind of the young child. Then the old diplomat, who turns out to be a fool really later, he said a few words of compliment, you know, to the actress, oh, she's such a great actress and so on. And these few words by that man, who had no importance in his life, restored the faith which had been destroyed by the real experience of the theater, restored his faith in the actress, in everything. The experience he had not had, in a way, was recreated by the words of that man. And then so this is a description of the inner life, inner spiritual, intellectual, psychological life of the child, which is totally contrary to our expectations, you know, in a way showing that everything was more or less false, in the sense that he was completely submitting to the voice of the other, because at the beginning it was the voice of that great writer and so forth. The experience shattered his belief. But his belief was recreated by three insignificant sentences by that man who knew nothing, who had no profound experience of art or anything else, who was an old windbag, really, you see. So this is typically Proustian. If you start looking at it, you know, because after that, or before that, the construction, the mythical edifice of belief and so forth is a work of art, but has nothing to do with reality which is experienced later. Ultimately, he would become capable of differentiating between different artists and so on. But you must remember that he had never been to the theater. So he expected something magical that didn't exist. And his disappointment was great. But one word by an old fool, you know, recreated it. And I would say this is an extreme case, but this is typically Proustian. So even the aesthetic experience of Marcel Proust is totally tied to his relationship to other people. And you might say does not come from himself. Is totally mimetic in the sense that it's imitation of what he hears. But it's not an imitation that's voluntary, that's which is invincible in a way, which comes naturally, which is in a way the only type of immediacy he has, which is mediated by the other.